Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Mild History. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Perhaps you are curled up in a quiet bedroom, perhaps traveling on a dimly lit bus, or sitting in the stillness of a late evening. Wherever you are, I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend this time here. Tonight, we step not into castles or battlefields, but into a far humbler place, a bakery of the Victorian age. And though the story may seem simple, it carries with it weight, labor, and danger. For the job of a Victorian baker was not only hard, it could be deadly. Let us begin long before the sun rises. In a narrow London street, or perhaps in a small town by the countryside, the bakery stirs to life. The air outside is still and cool, but within, the warmth of the ovens already begins to glow. The bakers rise in the early hours, often before 3 in the morning. Some have slept only a few hours, their bodies aching from the previous day. Others, young apprentices, may not have slept at all, having stayed to clean or tend the fires through the night. The ovens must be ready before dawn. Bread is a daily necessity, and customers will arrive early, baskets in hand, expecting fresh loaves to take home. So the bakers light their fires while most of the town still sleeps. Coal or wood is fed into the mouths of the great brick ovens, their flames licking up the stone sides. The heat builds slowly, filling the room with smoke and warmth, long before the first dough has been shaped. The workspace is cramped. A low ceiling collects the heat, walls blackened with soot, and every surface dusted with flour. Heavy wooden tables line the room, their tops scarred with years of kneading. Bins of flour and sacks of grain are stacked against the walls. The floor is uneven stone, often slick with water spilled from buckets or with scraps of dough trodden underfoot. In this place, the day begins. Bakers strip down to shirt sleeves, rolling them above their elbows. Already, sweat glistens on their foreheads. The air is thick, heavy with dust and heat. They mix flour, water, yeast, and salt in great troughs, their arms plunging deep into the sticky mass. There are no machines here, not in most small bakeries. The strength of human arms is what shapes the dough. Hour after hour, the men and boys knead, fold, and stretch, their muscles straining, their backs bending. Apprentices scurry about, fetching water from pumps outside, carrying sacks of flour nearly as heavy as themselves or stoking the fires. They are often young, sometimes only 10 or 12 years old. Their wages are meager, and their hours endless. Yet this is their apprenticeship, their training for a trade that will consume their lives. Many never finish it. Illness, injury, or exhaustion takes them before they become masters. The master baker watches over the work, his eyes sharp. Bread is not just food, it is livelihood. A poorly baked loaf can mean lost customers, spoiled reputation, or worse. In an age when bread makes up the bulk of the working class diet, a baker who fails is not easily forgiven. So precision is demanded, even in these early hours, when fatigue weighs heavy on every limb. The dangers are already present, though not always noticed. Flour dust hangs in the air, invisible but deadly. Breathe it long enough, day after day, and the lungs begin to fail. The men cough, their chests tight, though few speak of it. Heat from the ovens seeps into the skin, parching throats, draining strength. Burns are common, a hand too close to the iron doors, an arm brushing against the glowing brick. Water sloshes onto the stone floor, mixing with flour to create a paste that hardens beneath boots, waiting to trip the unwary. But the work does not stop. There is no time for caution when dozens of loaves must be ready before sunrise. By 4 in the morning, the dough is rising. Great cloths cover the shaped loaves, holding in warmth, keeping out dust. The bakers snatch brief moments of rest, leaning against the tables, wiping sweat from their brows. But the respite is short. Soon, the ovens roar at full heat, and the loading begins. Wooden peels, long-handled paddles, are used to slide the loaves into the ovens. The work requires strength and precision. A single mistake can send dough collapsing onto the hot stones, ruining hours of labor. The heat at the oven's mouth is unbearable, forcing the men to turn their faces away, their skin reddening as if scalded by boiling water. Yet they press forward, sweat dripping, arms aching, loading loaf after loaf into the fiery maw. Time seems to blur. Minutes stretch into hours as the bakers work in rhythm, mixing, kneading, shaping, loading, unloading. The air grows hotter, thicker, the smell of yeast and smoke mingling until it clings to hair and clothing. Outside, the sky begins to pale with the first light of dawn, but within the bakery, time is measured only by the rising of dough and the burning of fire. Soon, the first loaves are ready. Golden crusts crackle as they are pulled from the ovens, steam rising in clouds. The apprentices carry them to the counters, stacking them in neat rows. Already, the first customers appear at the door, maids sent by wealthy households, mothers with baskets for their families, men seeking food before work. The bakery fills with voices, with coins clinking on the counter, with the smell of fresh bread. To the customers, it is a simple transaction, money for a loaf, food for the day. But behind each loaf lies hours of toil, sweat, and risk. For the bakers, this is only the beginning. The day stretches long ahead, with more dough to mix, more fires to stoke, more loaves to bake. The fatigue of the night will linger, but there is no choice. Bread is life, and those who bake it must give their own strength, their own health, to keep it on the tables of others. And so the Victorian bakery begins its day, not with joy, not with leisure, but with labor heavy and dangerous. Before the world has fully woken, the bakers have already faced fire, dust, exhaustion, and risk. Their work is essential, but their lives are fragile. And this is only the first chapter in the story of the deadly job of a Victorian baker. The heart of the bakery may have been its ovens, but its lifeblood was flour. Without flour, there was no dough, no bread, no livelihood. Yet this very substance that gave sustenance to millions was also one of the greatest threats to the lives of the men and boys who worked with it each day. Step into the Victorian bakery once more. The air is never truly clear. Each sack of flour, when opened, releases a pale cloud, fine as smoke, drifting into the lungs of those nearby. Each time a baker tips flour into a trough or scatters it across a table, another veil of white dust rises. When the kneading begins, flour clings to skin, clothing, and hair, and a haze settles over the room. By the end of a day's work, the bakers are not only covered in sweat, but also blanketed in a layer of powder that coats their faces and fills the lines of their hands. At first glance, it might seem harmless. Flour is food, after all. But breathed in over months and years, it becomes something else entirely. The lungs are delicate, never meant to endure the constant intrusion of fine particles. Over time, bakers developed what came to be known as baker's lung, a chronic condition marked by coughing, wheezing, and breathlessness. In the quieter hours of night, when the ovens cooled and the shop was empty, the cough of the baker could still be heard echoing through the narrow rooms above the shop. This was not a passing sickness, but a slow, grinding decline. The body weakened, stamina faded, and chest pains grew sharper. For some, the illness became so severe that each breath was a struggle. And yet, few could leave their trade. Bread was their livelihood, their only skill, and to abandon the bakery was to abandon survival itself. And so they endured, coughing and laboring, day after day, knowing each breath brought more damage. Apprentices, too, suffered early. Their young lungs, not yet hardened by years of work, were particularly vulnerable. A boy might begin his apprenticeship with vitality, running errands and stoking fires with boundless energy. Yet within a few short years, he might find himself coughing as though he were already an old man. For many, the apprenticeship became not a path to mastery, but an early march toward infirmity. The dust also carried other risks. Flour, when suspended in the air in sufficient quantity, is combustible. In large mills and industrial bakeries, explosions sometimes occurred, sparked by a single flame or careless strike. Though less common in small-town bakeries, the risk lingered, invisible and ever-present. The very air the bakers breathed was not only suffocating, but also volatile. Disease was not limited to the lungs. The Victorian bakery was a place where heat, moisture, and close quarters created fertile ground for sickness of every kind. Hygiene was poor, and infections spread easily. Hands that moved from dough to tools to faces carried unseen bacteria. Cuts and burns, so common in the trade, could quickly fester. With limited medical knowledge and scarce treatment, a small wound could swell into a deadly infection. The long hours and punishing labor also left the body vulnerable. Fatigue wore down immune systems, making bakers more susceptible to colds, fevers, and other ailments. Nights without rest, days spent in sweltering heat, and a diet often composed of little more than the very bread they produced left them weakened. Bread might feed others, but for the bakers themselves, it was a meager sustenance, insufficient to replace the energy they lost in their toil. The close proximity of workers meant that when one fell ill, others often followed. A cough in one corner of the bakery became a cough in another. Apprentices shared not only their labors but also their sicknesses, sleeping in cramped quarters above the shop, where air circulation was poor and damp crept through the walls. Customers, too, were not untouched. In an era before rigorous food safety standards, contamination was a real risk. Dough handled by sick hands might carry illness into households. Bread that appeared wholesome could conceal unseen dangers. Yet customers rarely suspected, for the bakery was a place of nourishment, not hazard, or so they believed. It is important to remember that flour dust was not the only danger that stalked these bakers. It was simply the most constant. Day and night, it hung in the air, invisible yet inescapable. Unlike the sudden burn of an oven or the sharp pain of a cut, it gave no warning. It offered no single moment of crisis to overcome. Instead, it worked slowly, silently, until the baker could no longer draw breath without struggle. In the evenings, when the last loaves had been sold and the doors closed, the bakers might gather in the dim rooms above the shop. They sat weary on wooden stools, their hands still white with flour, their lungs heavy. The cough would begin in one, then another, until the room seemed filled with the sound of hacking chests. They did not speak of it often. To do so was to admit weakness. And in their world, weakness meant ruin. Yet behind their silence lay the unspoken truth, that the very substance they worked with each day, the flour that sustained a nation, was also the slow poison that destroyed them. When you picture the Victorian bakery, you might imagine warmth, the smell of fresh bread, the bustle of customers at dawn. And indeed, it was all of those things. But hidden behind the crust of every loaf was the price paid by those who baked it. A price measured not in coins, but in lungs scarred, bodies weakened, and lives shortened. And so the flour, white and pure in appearance, was in truth a darker thing. A powder that fed millions, yet claimed the breath of those who handled it. The bread that graced Victorian tables was not merely baked in fire, but forged through sacrifice. Burns, blisters, and broken bodies. If flour dust was the silent enemy of the Victorian baker, then heat was the ever-present tyrant. Step into the bakery again, and you will feel it instantly. The suffocating wave that presses against the skin, seeps into the bones, and makes each movement heavy. The ovens burned without pause, their fires kept alive hour after hour, day after day. These brick giants were the heart of the bakery, but they were also merciless in their demands. To approach them was to risk injury. A moment's distraction while sliding in a tray of dough could mean a searing burn across the forearm. A careless grip on a wooden peel might slip, sending a hand against blistering stone. Even the air just beyond the open mouth of the oven was dangerous. The heat rolled out in shimmering waves, capable of scalding the skin before contact was ever made. The bakers bore these injuries as part of their trade. Scars ran across wrists and knuckles like unspoken badges of survival. Bandages were few, salves expensive, and relief hard to find. Most burns were treated with little more than cool water, if that. Infection was a constant risk. A blister that burst during work might be rubbed raw again within hours, exposed to flour, sweat, and smoke. Hands, the tools of the baker's craft, were constantly under assault. The kneading of dough was a physical act, pounding, folding, and stretching with relentless force. The skin cracked, nails tore, and joints swelled from strain. Fingers grew thickened and stiff, and wrists ached with the endless repetition of labor. In an age with no ergonomic concern, the body itself was the machine, and its wear was inevitable. Feet fared no better. Bakers stood for endless hours on stone floors, sometimes slick with water or dusted with flour. Slips were common. A stumble with a heavy tray could mean twisted ankles or even broken bones. There was rarely time to rest or heal. Injuries that might demand weeks of recovery were endured with grit, for to stop working was to risk losing one's place and one's livelihood. The back, too, bore its own punishment. Sacks of flour were heavy, sometimes weighing more than a man could reasonably carry. Yet they had to be lifted, hoisted onto shoulders, and carried across cramped spaces. Bent postures, repeated strain, and sudden slips led to injuries that never fully healed. A baker who hurt his back might walk stooped for the rest of his life, his body marked permanently by his toil. Accidents with tools added another layer of danger. Wooden peels, sharp knives, and iron trays were in constant use, often wielded quickly in the rush to keep up with demand. A slip of the blade meant deep cuts. A tray drop meant crushed fingers. Blood mingled with flour, but work rarely stopped. The urgency of bread making allowed no pause for caution. And there was fire, the most feared hazard of all. With ovens blazing and wooden structures surrounding them, bakeries were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. A single overturned oil lamp, a stray ember, or a neglected flame could engulf the entire shop in minutes. Stories of bakeries reduced to ash were not rare, and many bakers lived with the quiet knowledge that the very place of their livelihood could become their death trap. Beyond the bakery itself, deliveries carried their own risks. Heavy baskets of bread had to be hauled across uneven cobbled streets. In rain, the stones were slick; in winter, they froze. A misstep could send both man and bread tumbling. Horses and carts crowded the roads, and collisions were not uncommon. Even outside the ovens, the life of a baker remained fraught with danger. The injuries were not only physical. The heat drained the body of water, leaving bakers perpetually dehydrated. The relentless exposure to sweltering temperatures led to fainting spells. A baker collapsing near an oven could be burned before he even woke. Exhaustion dulled reflexes, making accidents all the more likely. And yet, remarkably, these hardships at night, when the ovens cooled and silence returned, the aches remained. Blisters throbbed, cuts smarted, muscles burned with fatigue. Yet there was little chance for recovery. The next dawn would come, and with it, the same burns, the same blisters, the same broken bodies pressed back into service. It is easy to imagine the Victorian bakery as quaint, with the warm glow of firelight and the comforting smell of bread. But behind that charm lay a harsher truth. Each loaf that emerged golden and crusted had cost its maker pain. The bread that fed the many was built on the wounds of the few. And so the baker's trade, noble in its purpose, remained brutal in its practice. Every burn told of work too close to the fire, every blister of labor too long endured, every broken bone of accidents too common to prevent. It was, in every sense, a profession where the body itself was consumed, just as surely as the wood that fueled the ovens. The endless night shifts. The world of the Victorian baker was governed not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the rhythm of bread. To provide fresh loaves for households each morning, the work began when most of the city slept. Midnight, 1 o'clock, perhaps 2, the exact hour hardly mattered. What did matter was that by dawn, the ovens had to be roaring, the dough kneaded, the bread rising, and the first trays of loaves ready to be sold. Imagine the baker rousing himself from a short, restless sleep. The bed above the shop is cramped, the air heavy with the lingering smell of smoke and flour. He wakes in darkness, rubbing eyes gritty with fatigue. Outside, the streets are silent save for the occasional rattle of a cart or the distant bark of a dog. The city still slumbers, but in the bakery, the day is already beginning. The first task is the fire. Ovens must be stoked back to life, wood stacked and flames coaxed into a steady roar. The heat builds slowly, brick by brick, until the chamber glows with a dangerous light. Meanwhile, apprentices set to their labor. Sacks of flour are dragged into position, water hauled in heavy buckets, yeast mixed, and troughs prepared. The night is only beginning, but already the workers are sweating. There is no gentle easing into the shift. The pace is set from the start, demanding and relentless. Dough must be mixed in enormous batches, kneaded with both hands and whole bodies pressing into the task. The troughs are deep, and the work is punishing. Apprentices climb in with bare feet to stamp and fold the heavy mass, their skin burning from the heat of the rising dough and raw from repeated contact with flour and water. The air is filled with the sounds of labor, grunts, the slap of dough, the clatter of wooden tools. As hours crawl past, exhaustion grows heavier. Fatigue gnaws at limbs, and minds drift into fog. But there is no time to stop. Every pause delays the next step in the delicate chain of bread making. The yeast must rise at the proper pace, the oven must be at the proper heat. The loaves must be ready for the customers who will arrive as soon as the first light breaks the horizon. Sleep deprivation is its own form of torture. The human body is not meant to thrive in reversed hours, and the baker's life is a life lived against the clock. Toiling while the world sleeps brings not only physical weariness, but also a deep sense of isolation. Others rest, dream, and wake refreshed, while the baker stumbles through endless nights of labor. His companions are not friends or family, but the constant cough of an apprentice, the hiss of steam, and the crackle of the oven fire. By dawn, when the city begins to stir, the bakers are already spent. Their bodies ache, their eyes burn, and their stomachs churn from irregular meals. Yet this is the busiest time of all. Customers line the counters, eager for their loaves, demanding freshness, flavor, and speed. The bakers must push past their exhaustion, serving each one with steady hands, though their minds feel as though they are drifting in a fog. When the last loaf is sold and the counters swept clean, it is late morning. For many, this is the time others are beginning their daily work. For the baker, it is the moment he finally leaves the oven's side. His clothes are damp with sweat, his hair stiff with flour. The walk upstairs to his narrow bed feels longer than it should. He collapses into sleep not in comfort, but in desperation, body begging for rest. But even sleep brings no true relief. It is broken by noise from the street, by the rumble of carts and the chatter of neighbors. Daylight pours through thin curtains, piercing tired eyes. The body craves silence and darkness, but the world outside refuses to pause. The baker's sleep is restless, shallow, never enough to restore what was lost. By evening, he wakes still weary, only to prepare once more for another long night of labor. This cycle repeats endlessly. Night after night, week after week, year after year, the baker toils against the natural rhythm of life. Over time, the consequences are severe. Chronic fatigue wears down not only the body but also the spirit. Tempers shorten, minds cloud, and health deteriorates. Stomach ailments, headaches, and nervous exhaustion become constant companions. Family life suffers as well. The baker rises when his children sleep and sleeps when his children rise. Meals are rarely shared, conversations rare. His world is confined to the dim light of the bakery, his relationships strained by absence. Even when present, he is often too exhausted to fully engage. For many bakers, life outside the ovens becomes a shadow, fleeting and insubstantial compared to the relentless demands of the trade. The apprentices, often mere boys, endure this schedule from the moment they enter the trade. Pulled from their beds in the dead of night, they stumble bleary-eyed into labor that taxes their still-growing bodies. Their lives, too, become twisted around the bakery's timetable. Childhood fades quickly, replaced by weary routine. Some found small relief in stimulants, tea, strong coffee, even beer, to push through the darkest hours of night. But these were fleeting comforts, doing little to restore true strength. The exhaustion remained, gnawing at them until it became a permanent condition. There is a particular cruelty to this existence. Unlike sudden injuries or dramatic accidents, the endless night shift eroded life slowly and visibly. It did not strike in an instant, but rather wore a man down grain by grain, until all that remained was fatigue. And yet, despite it all, the bread was ready each morning. Families across the city awoke to the smell of fresh loaves, never thinking of the men who had labored through the night to bring it to them. For the customers, the bakery was a place of warmth and nourishment. For the bakers, it was a world of exhaustion, burns, and scars hidden behind the crust of every loaf. So, as dawn broke over Victorian streets, with the gas lamps dimming and the first carriages clattering over cobblestones, the bakers retreated into weary sleep. The city thrived on their labor, but few paused to wonder at the price. The endless night shifts consumed lives in silence, as surely as the ovens consumed wood and coal. A cycle unbroken, a demand unyielding, and a burden that left its mark on every man, woman, and child who bore the title of baker. Apprentices and child labor. When we picture a bakery, we may imagine seasoned bakers with years of experience, men with broad shoulders, flour-dusted aprons, and hands hardened by countless loaves of bread. But in the Victorian bakery, much of the work fell not to these veterans, but to children. Apprentices, some no older than 10 or 11, bore the brunt of tasks too menial, too exhausting, or too degrading for their masters. Child labor was no rare thing in the Victorian world. From coal mines to textile mills, from chimney sweeping to street hawking, children were everywhere, their small bodies bent to labor far beyond their years. The bakery was no exception. In fact, it relied upon these children the apprenticeship system was, in theory, a noble tradition. A boy would be bound by contract to a master baker for a set number of years. In return for his labor, he would be taught the craft, given food, lodging, and eventually, the skills to become a journeyman or master himself. It was meant to be a path to stability, perhaps even prosperity. But the reality was far harsher. Apprentices were cheap labor, and their masters often cared more for their labor than their learning. From the moment they entered the bakery, these children were thrust into the most grueling duties. They carried sacks of flour heavier than their frames could bear, hauled buckets of water, stoked the ovens until their skin was red from heat, and swept the endless flour dust that settled on every surface. Their days, or rather their nights, began when the city was silent. Pulled from sleep at ungodly hours, they stumbled into the heat and noise of the bakery, still half dreaming. There was no easing into their duties. From the first hour, they were expected to keep pace with men twice their size and strength. Failure meant rebuke, sometimes even beatings. The physical toll was immense. Their small hands blistered from kneading heavy dough. Their backs strained beneath flour sacks. Burns and cuts were constant companions. Some apprentices bore scars for life, marks of their childhood spent in servitude to bread. Exhaustion gnawed at them, stunting their growth and weakening their health. Many aged prematurely, their childhood stolen by the relentless demands of the bakery. Living conditions were no kinder. Apprentices often slept in cramped quarters above the shop, in rooms filled with smoke, heat, and the smell of flour. Beds were shared, blankets thin, and privacy non-existent. The air was stale, damp, and thick with coughs. Illness spread easily, and recovery was rare in such conditions. Discipline was harsh. Masters demanded obedience, and apprentices who faltered were punished. A loaf burned, a sack dropped, or a tray mishandled could earn a scolding or worse. Beatings, though not universal, were not uncommon. Fear became as much a part of their lives as fatigue. And yet, in spite of this hardship, apprentices were indispensable. They were the unseen hands that kept the bakery alive. Without them, ovens would cool, troughs would sit empty, and loaves would never reach the counters by dawn. They were the gears in the great machine of bread making, and though they were often ignored, the bakery could not function without them. Some apprentices did rise through the ranks, enduring the years of hardship to become journeymen and eventually masters themselves. But many did not. Illness, injury, or sheer exhaustion ended countless apprenticeships before they reached their conclusion. Some boys fled, preferring the uncertainty of the streets to the certainty of the bakery's punishments. Others simply wasted away, their strength consumed by years of toil. Families, too, bore a heavy burden. For poorer households, placing a child into an apprenticeship was often seen as a necessity. It meant one less mouth to feed, and perhaps the promise of a future trade. But for mothers and fathers, the knowledge that their children were working long nights, exposed to danger and exhaustion, was a heavy sorrow. Letters home, if written at all, rarely conveyed the full extent of suffering. The apprentices themselves often lived with a quiet contradiction. On one hand, they were children, craving rest, play, and companionship. On the other, they were laborers, their identities tied to their trade. They grew up quickly, not because they wished to, but because they had no choice. Childhood games gave way to kneading troughs, laughter replaced by the hiss of ovens and the cough of flour-filled lungs. The toll was not only physical but emotional. Loneliness was common. Many apprentices were bound to masters far from their families, living among strangers. Homesickness gnawed at them, but there was little comfort. Their days were too long, their nights too short, and their world confined to the dim, hot chambers of the bakery. Society, for the most part, looked the other way. Child labor was seen as normal, even necessary. The bread that filled the tables of the middle and working classes was purchased with little thought for the children who had helped make it. Only later, as reform movements gained strength, would the plight of these apprentices come into sharper focus. For now, in the Victorian bakery, the system continued unbroken. Children entered as boys and, if they survived the years of exhaustion and injury, emerged as men marked forever by the trade. Their bodies bore scars, their lungs carried coughs, and their minds held memories of nights spent in endless toil. When we think of the bread that sustained Victorian society, it is easy to imagine it as the product of master bakers, skilled and experienced. But in truth, much of that bread passed through the hands of children, small, blistered, weary hands that never had the chance to rest. The loaves that graced Victorian tables were not only born of fire and flour, they were born of childhood sacrificed, of innocence surrendered, of apprentices bent too soon beneath the weight of labor. It was bread made not just of yeast and grain, but of youth itself. Hunger, diet, and the baker's table. It may seem ironic that those who baked the very bread upon which Victorian society depended were often among the worst fed. To step inside a bakery was to be surrounded by food, the smell of rising loaves, the sight of flour sacks stacked high, the crackle of crusts forming in the oven's heat. And yet, for the bakers themselves, hunger was a familiar companion. Bread was abundant, yes, but bread alone cannot sustain a body already taxed by grueling hours of labor. The diet of many bakers was monotonous, plain, and often insufficient. A crust snatched between tasks, a bowl of porridge gulped quickly before dawn, a mug of weak tea to stave off fatigue. This was the rhythm of their meals. There was rarely time to sit, to savor, or to replenish the energy burned in endless toil. The irony deepened in the apprentices' lives. These children, whose bodies were still growing, needed nourishment most of all, yet they were fed little more than scraps. Some masters provided adequate meals, understanding that a starved apprentice was a useless one, but many did not. Cheap bread, thin gruel, or leftover crusts were deemed sufficient. Meat was a rarity, vegetables scarcer still. The result was stunted growth, weakened health, and bodies that withered long before their time. Imagine the bakery at dawn, the counters crowded with golden loaves awaiting customers. The air is fragrant, warm, almost intoxicating. Customers arrive eager, paying their pennies or shillings for bread to take home. Yet behind the counter, the apprentices gnaw at yesterday's stale crumbs, their stomachs still hollow. The very bread they produce in such abundance is not theirs to enjoy. It is property, not sustenance. The lack of variety in diet brought its own slow torment. Bread, porridge, and the occasional cup of ale formed the bulk of their intake. Fresh fruit, milk, or fish were luxuries. Eggs and cheese, if they appeared at all, were rare indulgences. Over time, deficiencies took root. Skin grew pale, teeth weakened, and fatigue became ever more crushing. The irony was cruel. The bakers fed the city, yet the city left its bakers hungry. Some sought comfort in drink. Ale and beer were cheap, common, and often safer than water, which could be tainted with disease. But reliance on alcohol brought its own problems. For some, it dulled the aches and hunger. For others, it bred dependency, deepening fatigue rather than relieving it. Coffee and tea were consumed when affordable, their caffeine offering a fleeting spark of energy to endure the endless night shifts. Hunger was not only physical, but also psychological. The act of working surrounded by food, kneading it, shaping it, smelling it, but not eating it, was its own form of torment. The contrast between abundance and denial weighed heavily on the apprentices, whose young eyes watched loaf after loaf vanish into customers' baskets while their own bellies ached. The baker's table, if such a thing could be called that, was rarely a place of family gathering. Meals were rushed, taken standing between tasks. The heat of the oven, the pressure of time, and the unending demands of dough left little space for leisure. A crust of bread eaten with weary hands became a meal. A sip of ale between batches passed for refreshment. Dining was not about pleasure but survival. In wealthier bakeries, conditions were somewhat better. Journeymen and masters might enjoy fuller meals, roasts, vegetables, or stews, especially if they lived above their shops with families who cooked. But even then, the timing of meals was warped by the demands of the trade. Dinner might be taken at midnight, breakfast at dusk, lunch in the dead of night. The baker's stomach rarely knew consistency, and his digestion often paid the price. The public, of course, rarely gave thought to the baker's hunger. For them, the bakery was a place of satisfaction, a source of comfort and sustenance. Customers left with baskets full, their children chewing happily on warm rolls. Few paused to consider the irony that the very hands that shaped their food might themselves be trembling with hunger. Hunger also bred resentment, particularly among apprentices. They watched customers leave with abundance while they scraped by on scraps. Some stole crusts or rolls when they could, risking punishment for the sake of their own stomachs. A hidden roll tucked beneath a shirt, a crust pocketed when no one watched. These small acts of theft were desperate, born not from greed but from need. The effects of this poor diet stretched far beyond the bakery itself. Many bakers lived shorter lives, their health broken not only by flour dust and burns, but also by malnutrition. Their bodies, starved of nutrients, had little defense against illness. Tuberculosis, infections, and fevers claimed many, their weakened frames unable to resist. For the apprentices, the legacy was even starker. Childhood malnutrition stunted not only their growth, but also their futures. Many entered adulthood already weakened, their capacity for labor diminished, their chances of long lives reduced. The bread trade, rather than raising them up, had consumed their strength before they even reached maturity. And yet, despite all this, bread remained the central symbol of sustenance. It was the food of the poor, the staple of the working class, the one thing that could not be done without. For society, bread was life. For the baker, bread was both life and loss, life in its production, loss in its consumption by others, while he himself remained hungry. As we picture the baker's table, let us not imagine it laden with variety or warmth. Instead, see a crust eaten in haste, a mug of ale to wash it down, and a weary man or boy chewing mechanically, his thoughts already drifting back to the next batch of dough, the next sack of flour, the next night of labor. Hunger was not an occasional visitor in the Victorian bakery. It was a permanent guest, seated at the table beside every loaf. It shaped the bakers' bodies, shortened their lives, and added one more layer of hardship to a trade already defined by sacrifice. And so, even as the ovens roared and bread nourished a nation, The bakers themselves remained underfed, undernourished, and unseen. The bread of life was, for them, also the bread of hunger. The baker's family and social life. Behind every loaf of bread baked in a Victorian oven was not just a worker, but a man with ties beyond the bakery. Family, neighbors, friends, or perhaps the faint hope of leisure. Yet the life of the baker was so consuming, so relentless in its rhythm, that family and social ties often withered beneath the weight of exhaustion. To be a baker was to live not just with flour and fire, but also with isolation. The baker's family life was shaped entirely by the demands of his trade. His hours were reversed, his days swallowed by sleep, his nights consumed by work. When others in his household gathered for breakfast, he might be collapsing into bed, too weary to speak. When his children returned from school, eager to share the stories of their day, he might already be preparing for another night at the ovens. Conversations were fleeting, meals rarely shared. Family bonds, though not absent, were thin and frayed, stretched across the gulf created by his endless shifts. For the children of bakers, the absence of a father during daylight hours became a familiar sorrow. They learned not to expect him at the table, not to see him at school events or in church pews. He was present in body, yes, but often absent in spirit, worn down by fatigue. His love was not diminished, but his ability to show it was constrained by exhaustion. A pat on the head, a crust offered from the counter, or a brief word before sleep, these became the rare tokens of his affection. Wives, too, bore the burden of the baker's absence. While their husbands worked through the night, they kept households running, raising children, and often assisting with the business side of the bakery itself. Some managed the front counter, serving customers with practiced politeness, even as their husbands labored unseen in the heat of the ovens. Their roles were vital but often undervalued, hidden behind the image of the baker as the sole provider. In smaller towns and villages, where the bakery was a family enterprise, wives and children sometimes joined directly in the work. A wife might help knead dough or prepare accounts, while older children carried trays or delivered loaves. The bakery was not only a place of work, but also of shared struggle, binding families together through toil. Yet even then, the long hours and constant fatigue eroded tenderness, leaving little space for leisure or warmth. The social life of the baker beyond his family was equally constrained. Friendships struggled to survive when one man's waking hours were another's sleeping ones. The baker missed village gatherings, Sunday fairs, and late evening tavern conversations. His companions were his fellow workers, bound together in sweat and silence rather than merriment. For many bakers, camaraderie existed only in the quiet nod of another weary man across the dough trough, a bond forged not by choice but by necessity. When leisure did appear, it was fleeting and precious. A rare afternoon free from deliveries, a Sunday when ovens cooled, or a holiday when customers did not demand bread. These became the baker's moments of reprieve. Yet leisure often felt hollow. The body, so accustomed to labor, resisted relaxation. Limbs twitched, eyes closed too quickly, and exhaustion turned even joy into another form of weariness. Still, some sought to carve moments of humanity from their punishing schedules. A baker might sit outside his shop, enjoying a pipe as neighbors passed. He might share a pint of ale with a friend, his laughter subdued but genuine. He might walk with his children through the streets, hand in hand, while customers nodded in recognition of the man who fed their homes. These moments were rare but vital, lifelines that tethered him to the world beyond ovens and flour sacks. Yet, isolation remained the defining feature of the baker's social life. His reversed hours made him a stranger in his own community. When others gathered in the evening, he was at work. When they rose to begin their days, he stumbled into bed. Even church, the center of Victorian community, was difficult to attend. For many bakers, Sundays were not days of rest but of heightened demand, as households prepared feasts that required fresh bread. This separation bred quiet loneliness. Bakers were not hermits, yet their trade made them feel apart. They were essential to society, yet often unseen within it. Their names might be known to customers, but their lives were largely invisible. They existed in the margins, providing sustenance while themselves starved of companionship. Children who apprenticed in bakeries endured even harsher forms of isolation. Torn from their families, they lived under the roofs of their masters, surrounded by strangers. Their childhood friendships dissolved as their nights filled with labor and their days with restless sleep. Loneliness became their silent companion, etched into their young faces long before adulthood. And yet, for all its hardship, the bakery was not devoid of community. Among the workers themselves, bonds formed, quiet, unspoken bonds of endurance. They shared the same burns, the same coughs, the same fatigue. They understood each other's silence, the slump of shoulders, the cough in the dark. They were companions not in leisure but in suffering, united by the very hardships that cut them off from the rest of society. To outsiders, the baker might appear prosperous. He had a trade, a shop, a place in the community. But beneath this veneer lay the reality of strained family bonds, absent social ties, and nights of crushing isolation. The bread he sold was the bread of connection for others, yet for him, it often came at the cost of his own connections. So when we think of the baker's family and social life, we must imagine not bustling tables or vibrant friendships, but fleeting gestures, rare moments of respite, and the quiet ache of absence. The oven did not just consume wood and dough, it consumed time, companionship, and intimacy. The baker's life was not merely one of labor. It was one of separation, of sacrifice, of longing for moments with family and community that his trade rarely allowed. And yet, through it all, he endured. For as long as there was bread to bake, there was no escaping the rhythm of flour, fire, and the endless night. Fires, explosions, and disasters. Few trades lived so close to fire as the bakers. The ovens were the heartbeat of the Victorian bakery, roaring day and night with the promise of bread. But what kept the ovens alive also threatened to consume the baker's livelihood, and sometimes his very life. The risk of fire and disaster was constant, and every baker knew that the same flames that baked golden loaves could, in an instant, devour everything he owned. To begin with, the ovens themselves were treacherous. They were built of thick stone or brick, designed to hold heat long after flames had died down. Stoked with wood, coal, or coke, they required constant tending. A spark leaping from the open mouth of an oven could ignite flour dust, wooden beams, or sacks of grain stacked too close. In shops where space was tight, materials were often crowded together, creating a tinderbox that needed only the smallest ember to erupt. Flour dust, so familiar and seemingly harmless, was among the most dangerous of all. Invisible to the naked eye, suspended particles could transform the very air into fuel. In larger mills and industrial bakeries, flour dust explosions became notorious. A single careless strike of flint, the sudden flare of a candle, or even the spark of static could ignite the cloud, releasing a blast powerful enough to shatter windows and collapse walls. While smaller street bakeries faced less dramatic risks, the fear was ever present. The air itself, heavy with flour, could betray them. Even when explosions did not occur, fire haunted the trade. Ovens were left burning for long hours, sometimes overnight, and accidents were frequent. Chimneys clogged with soot and ash could smolder unnoticed, igniting roof beams above. Oil lamps used to light the bakery in the dark hours before dawn added another hazard, their flames vulnerable to tipping or spilling. In the cramped, airless rooms above the shop, where apprentices and bakers' families often slept, a fire downstairs could trap them before escape was possible. The consequences of such disasters were devastating. For small-town bakers, the shop was not only a workplace but also a home. To lose it in flames was to lose livelihood, shelter, and possessions in one cruel stroke. Insurance, if it existed at all, was meager. A single blaze could reduce years of labor to ash, leaving families destitute overnight. And worse still, fires often claimed lives. Bakers, apprentices, and customers alike were caught in infernos that spread too quickly to escape. The danger was not confined to the ovens. Deliveries carried their own hazards. Horses pulling carts laden with bread could bolt, overturning loads and scattering loaves into the streets. A cart tipped into a lantern could spark a blaze, spreading from stall to stall in crowded markets. In cities like London, where buildings stood shoulder to shoulder and streets teemed with vendors, even a small fire could leap from shop to shop, transforming into catastrophe. Stories of bakery fires traveled quickly, carried on the tongues of neighbors, and chronicled in local papers. They were cautionary tales, reminders that the baker's prosperity rested on fragile foundations. To the public, a fire was spectacle and tragedy. To bakers, it was a nightmare too close to home. Every time they stoked their ovens, they knew they played with forces that could not always be contained. The psychological toll was immense. Apprentices slept uneasily above the shop, ears pricked for the sound of crackling flames. Masters woke in the night to check their ovens, hands trembling as they felt the walls for dangerous heat. Families lived with the constant awareness that their survival was tied to a fire that never truly rested. And yet, despite the fear, the work continued. Fires were too common to halt trade. too devastating to ignore, yet too bound to the craft to avoid. The baker had no choice but to work with the very element that threatened him. Bread demanded heat, and heat demanded fire. There was no escaping it. Communities sometimes rallied after disasters, raising funds to help bakers rebuild. But charity was fickle, and competition fierce. A rival might benefit from a neighbor's misfortune, gaining customers while another rebuilt. The world of bread was unforgiving, and recovery, if it came, was slow. The irony of it all was sharp. Bread, the food of comfort and life, was forged in conditions of danger and destruction. The same flames that filled homes with nourishment also left families homeless. Every golden crust carried with it the silent shadow of fire, the knowledge that in making it, bakers had flirted with ruin. Disasters shaped not only bakeries but entire communities. A bakery fire could spread to neighboring houses, destroying streets, displacing families, and scarring towns for decades. The smell of smoke lingered in memories long after the ashes cooled. Survivors spoke of crackling walls, collapsing beams, and the desperate cries of those trapped within. In some ways, fire became part of the baker's identity. Scars on arms and faces were not just the result of accidents at the oven, but reminders of larger calamities endured. Men who had lost shops rebuilt them, carrying the memory of fire in their weary eyes. Apprentices who fled flames returned to labor, their fear tempered into stoic resolve. Fire, for all its terror, became as familiar as flour and dough. But even with vigilance, disasters could never be fully prevented. Fire, dust, and disaster were not occasional intruders in the Victorian bakery. They were constant companions, lurking behind every task, every loaf, every breath. So the baker worked on, day after day, night after night, beneath the shadow of fire. He accepted the risk because he had no choice. His trade demanded it, his family depended on it, and his customers expected it. The bakery was both sanctuary and trap, a place where life was sustained and destroyed in equal measure. The fires and explosions of the Victorian bakery remind us that history is not only written in triumphs and innovations, but also in dangers borne quietly, in sacrifices made without recognition. Each loaf of bread carried not just the warmth of the oven, but also the memory of smoke, the fear of ruin, and the resilience of those who endured. Bread, class, and the price of survival. Bread was more than food in Victorian Britain, it was survival. For the poor, it was the staple of every meal, the cheapest and most filling source of calories. For the middle classes, it was a symbol of respectability, proof that they could afford fresh, white loaves rather than the coarser brown bread of their laboring neighbors. For the wealthy, bread was almost invisible, taken for granted alongside meat, fish, and luxuries from across the empire. Yet regardless of class, bread united society in one way. It was indispensable. The baker stood at the center of this economy of hunger and hope. His work bridged the gap between fields of wheat and the tables of households. And yet, while he was vital to every class, his own position remained precarious, balanced between profit and poverty. For the working poor, bread was often the only guarantee of sustenance. A loaf might be divided among a family of 6, stretched with dripping or watered broth. Parents went hungry so children could eat crusts. Bread was cheap compared to meat or dairy, but even then, prices fluctuated with the harvest. A bad year meant hunger rippling through crowded tenements, while bakers faced angry customers demanding loaves they could scarcely afford. Riots sometimes broke out when prices rose too high. Bakeries attacked, windows smashed, loaves stolen in desperation. The baker was caught in the middle, blamed both for charging too much and for not providing enough. The middle classes approached bread differently. For them, white bread was not only nourishment, but a marker of status. The whiter the loaf, the higher the prestige, for it suggested refined flour free of husks and grit. Brown bread, once common, became associated with poverty and rough living. Bakers were pressured to produce ever whiter loaves, even if it meant adulterating flour with chalk, alum, or other substances to meet demand. The result was bread that looked fine but sometimes carried hidden dangers, slowly poisoning those who ate it. For the wealthy, bread was rarely a subject of concern. Their tables overflowed with variety, and bread played a supporting role, served alongside meat, wine, and imported delicacies. They rarely set foot in bakeries themselves. Servants fetched the loaves, and the labor behind them remained invisible. Yet even they relied on bakers, for bread formed the silent foundation of every household meal, from grand feasts to simple breakfasts. The social divide revealed itself in the baker's counter. The poor arrived early, clutching coins, hoping to secure cheaper, smaller loaves before they sold out. Middle-class customers demanded larger, finer loaves, their expectations high and their complaints loud. The wealthy, detached from such concerns, rarely interacted directly, yet their tastes shaped trends across the city. The baker's own relationship with bread was filled with irony. He baked it in abundance, yet often could not afford the variety his customers enjoyed. His family ate crusts, day-old loaves, and the occasional scraps left unsold. While others judged bread by whiteness or softness, he judged it by survival. Would this day's sales be enough to pay the miller, the supplier, the landlord? Would his own children have bread tomorrow, or would it all go to customers? Bread was also a currency of trust. A baker's reputation depended not only on quality, but also on fairness. Short-weight loaves, bread lighter than advertised, could ruin his name. Yet in times of hardship, some bakers cheated out of desperation, shaving ounces from loaves or padding flour with cheaper fillers. Discovery brought shame, fines, or worse. Trust, once lost, was rarely regained, and in communities where bread meant survival, betrayal cut deep. Class tensions sharpened in these moments. The poor accused bakers of greed, bakers accused millers of overcharging, and millers blamed harvests and landlords. The chain of bread production became a chain of grievances, each link pulling tighter in years of scarcity. The baker, positioned between supplier and customer, bore the brunt of the anger, his shop windows shattered, his family threatened. The price of bread was, in truth, the price of survival itself. For every family that could not afford a loaf, hunger loomed. Malnutrition spread, children wasted away, and illness thrived in weakened bodies. Bread riots were not mere acts of anger but cries of desperation, born of the knowledge that without bread there was nothing. And yet, bread was also a source of comfort. A fresh loaf carried a sense of warmth and safety, a reminder that life, though hard, still held sustenance. For families, the act of sharing bread was almost sacred, a daily ritual that bound them together. Even in poverty, bread gave shape to meals, turning meager scraps into something resembling nourishment. The baker's role in this drama was paradoxical. He was both provider and victim, essential yet expendable. He fed the city, yet struggled to feed his own. He was praised when loaves were plentiful and cursed when they were scarce. His work upheld the very fabric of Victorian society, yet his life was often one of quiet hardship, invisible to those he served. Bread, in the Victorian world, was never just food. It was a mirror of class, a measure of wealth and want, a symbol of survival and inequality. The white loaves on a middle-class table spoke of refinement, while the coarse crusts in a laborer's hand spoke of endurance. And in every loaf, regardless of its color or weight, was the unacknowledged labor of bakers who risked health, safety, and peace of mind to bring it forth. To speak of bread in this era is to speak of power, class, and life itself. It was the currency of the poor, the pride of the middle classes, and the quiet constant of the wealthy. And at its heart was the baker, toiling in fire and flour, bearing the weight of hunger and expectation alike. So, as loaves left the ovens and filled Victorian tables, they carried more than sustenance. They carried the marks of class struggle, the shadow of hunger, and the silent story of the men and children whose hands made them possible. Women in the bakery, wives, daughters, and workers. When we picture the Victorian bakery, our minds often summon images of flour-dusted men, their arms buried in dough, their foreheads beaded with sweat as they stoked roaring ovens. Yet this image, though common, leaves out an entire group of laborers whose work was no less essential: women. Wives, daughters, and sometimes hired female workers played critical roles in the life of the bakery, their presence shaping both its daily rhythm and its survival. The wife of the baker was rarely idle. While her husband and apprentices toiled with ovens and dough, she often managed the front of the shop. There she greeted customers, weighed loaves, collected coins, and kept careful accounts of who paid promptly and who owed debts. Her role demanded not only patience but also diplomacy, for she was the face of the bakery to the community. Customers might grumble about prices, complain about the size of a loaf, or demand fresher bread. It was she who soothed tempers, maintained goodwill, and ensured that the family's livelihood did not unravel in the delicate dance of daily transactions. But her labor did not stop at the counter. In many bakeries, wives also joined the production itself. They kneaded dough, shaped rolls, or helped load trays. When demand was high, during holidays, feast days, or harvest seasons, the line between shopkeeper and baker blurred. She might spend the night hauling trays and the day serving customers, her body exhausted but her determination unbroken. For daughters, the bakery became both a workplace and a school of sorts. From an early age, they helped with lighter tasks, sweeping flour from counters, polishing pans, fetching water, or carrying small baskets of bread to customers nearby. As they grew older, their duties expanded. Some learned to manage accounts like their mothers, while others worked beside their fathers, handling dough and ovens. Their lives, like their brothers, were shaped by labor, though society rarely granted them recognition for it. The contribution of women was not merely physical, but also emotional. They bore the weight of maintaining a semblance of normal family life amid the chaos of the bakery. A wife prepared meals at odd hours for her weary husband, soothed apprentices when homesickness struck, and raised children almost alone while her partner slept through daylight. Her resilience kept the household intact, even when the bakery consumed nearly every ounce of time and energy. In poorer households, where every penny mattered, women's labor was even more critical. Some wives rose at dawn to sell bread at markets, their voices carrying through the stalls as they called out prices. Others took on washing, sewing, or mending to supplement the family's income, all while still tied to the demands of the bakery. Their days stretched endlessly, filled with tasks that left little time for rest. Yet, for all their effort, women in the bakery rarely received recognition. Society framed the baker as the head of the trade, the craftsman, the provider. His wife was cast as a helper, her daughters as assistants, their work considered secondary even when it was vital. Their contributions were invisible, woven into the fabric of daily life, yet unacknowledged in the eyes of the community. Some women found opportunities for independence within the trade. Widows, for example, sometimes inherited bakeries after their husbands' deaths. These women stepped into roles of authority, managing ovens, apprentices, and accounts with the same skill as any man. Yet even then, they faced skepticism. Customers doubted their competence, rivals sought to undermine them, and the weight of expectation pressed heavily. For every successful widow who kept her bakery alive, many more were forced to close, unable to withstand the social and financial pressures of the trade. Daughters, too, faced limits. While sons could expect to inherit bakeries or set out as journeymen, daughters rarely had such paths open to them. Their labor was essential, yet temporary, ending when marriage carried them into new households. Few had the chance to build bakeries of their own, and their years of experience vanished into obscurity. The trade valued their work, but not their permanence. Even so, women left their imprint on the bakery in countless unseen ways. They shaped its reputation through their interactions with customers, maintained its stability through their household management, and sustained its workers with care and nourishment. Without them, many bakeries would have faltered, undone not by poor bread but by poor organization, frayed tempers, or neglected apprentices. The physical toll on women was immense. Their bodies bore the marks of labor just as men's did: calloused hands from kneading, sore backs from carrying trays, burns from ovens, and exhaustion from endless tasks. Yet their sacrifices were often hidden, dismissed as help rather than labor. Their struggles mirrored those of their husbands and sons, but without the recognition of belonging fully to the trade. And yet, amid the hardship, women carved moments of resilience. A wife might sing quietly as she swept the shop floor, her voice soft against the hum of the ovens. A daughter might find joy in the laughter of a sibling, even as they worked side by side. These moments of tenderness, though fleeting, offered a reminder that life was more than toil, that family and affection endured even under the weight of labor. In the wider world, reformers and social critics spoke often of child labor, dangerous machinery, and harsh working conditions. They rarely spoke of the women behind the bakery counter or in the kitchen above it. Their invisibility was itself a reflection of Victorian values, which praised women for domesticity, while ignoring the reality that many labored just as fiercely as men. So when we imagine the Victorian bakery, let us not see only men bent over dough or tending ovens. Let us also picture the wife at the counter, her face tired but composed, balancing coins with care. Let us see the daughter sweeping flour with small, determined hands. Let us see the widow, standing firm against doubters as she keeps the ovens burning. The bakery was not merely a workplace of men, but a household industry, built on the backs of entire families. Women's labor, though often overlooked, was as vital as the ovens themselves. Without it, the bread would not have reached the tables of Victorian homes. In every golden crust, in every loaf handed across the counter, there was a trace of their unseen effort. the invisible hands that sustained a trade and through it, an entire society. Bakers and community, trust, reputation, and conflict. The Victorian bakery was not simply a place of labor and trade. It was a cornerstone of the community, a space where neighbors gathered, gossip was exchanged, and trust was tested daily. Bread was not just food, it was a lifeline, and the baker stood at the center of this fragile relationship. His reputation could raise him up as a trusted figure, or destroy him with astonishing speed. Trust was everything in the baker's world. Customers depended on him to provide fair weight, honest flour, and bread that was safe to eat. A single accusation of cheating, a loaf lightened by an ounce, a suspicion of adulteration, could shatter years of goodwill. For the poor, who spent much of their wages on bread, even the smallest deception was intolerable. To be accused of dishonesty was to risk more than lost sales. It was to risk the wrath of a hungry community. Reputation was built loaf by loaf, day by day. A baker who delivered consistent quality, who treated customers fairly, and who extended credit in lean times could earn loyalty that lasted generations. Families might shop at the same bakery for decades, their trust passed from parent to child. A good reputation became as much a currency as coin, protecting the baker against rivals and ensuring steady business. But reputation was fragile. One rumor of chalk or alum mixed into flour, one loaf found lighter than it should be, one apprentice caught stealing, and trust could collapse overnight. In crowded Victorian streets, word traveled quickly. A whisper at the market, a complaint in church, a headline in the local paper. Suddenly the baker's name was tainted. Customers vanished, competitors pounced, and creditors demanded payment. Recovery was slow, if it came at all. Conflict between bakers and their customers was not rare. Bread riots were one of the darker features of Victorian life, erupting when prices rose beyond what the poor could pay. In such moments, the bakery could transform from a place of nourishment into a battleground. Crowds stormed shops, loaves were seized, windows smashed. The baker, who may himself have struggled under high flour prices, became the target of anger he could not control. Even in calmer times, disputes simmered. Customers argued over weight, over price, over freshness. Some demanded credit, promising to pay later but sometimes failing to do so. Bakers were caught between generosity and survival. Extend too much credit and risk ruin. Deny it and earn resentment. It was a delicate balance, and each decision shaped how the community saw them. Bakers, too, could be rivals with one another. In cities where several shops stood within walking distance, competition was fierce. Rumors of cheating were sometimes spread by rivals, whispered into ears to draw customers away. Signboards boasted of pure flour or honest weight, pointed jabs at competitors suspected of dishonesty. The bakery trade was not just about bread, it was about reputation wars fought in flour and fire. The role of the baker in community life extended beyond commerce. He was often seen as a figure of reliability, his ovens burning when the rest of the city slept. Neighbors noted his dedication, admired his stamina, and depended on him to provide bread no matter the season. Weddings, funerals, feast days, all required his loaves, binding his work to the very milestones of life. To be a baker was to be woven into the fabric of the community, whether loved or resented. And yet, the relationship between baker and community was never entirely equal. Customers judged him harshly, often blind to the hardships of his trade. They saw the loaves but not the burns, the flour dust, the sleepless nights. They expected abundance, even in times of scarcity, and fairness, even when survival demanded difficult choices. The baker walked a tightrope, balancing honesty, necessity, and the demands of a hungry crowd. Apprentices felt this tension keenly. Sent to deliver loaves door to door, they were often the first to hear complaints. A loaf judged too small, a crust too hard, a price too high. The anger fell on their young shoulders. They carried not only bread, but also the weight of their master's reputation, their every action reflecting upon the bakery. A careless word or misstep could invite rebuke, not only for themselves, but for their entire household. Despite the constant strain, moments of solidarity also existed. In hard winters, when snow-choked roads and flour supplies dwindled, communities sometimes rallied around their bakers. Neighbors brought wood for ovens, customers accepted smaller loaves without complaint, and gratitude replaced grumbling. In such times, the bakery became a symbol of endurance, a reminder that survival was shared. The social bonds formed through bread could be surprisingly strong. Customers knew the baker by name, his shop a familiar part of their daily routine. Children remembered the smell of his ovens, the warmth of his counter, the rare treat of a sweet bun pressed into their hands. The bakery was not just a business, it was a space of memory, tied to the rhythms of community life. But reputation always loomed, fragile as the crust of a fresh loaf. One scandal could undo years of goodwill, leaving a baker ruined. For every shop that thrived, another fell into obscurity, its name spoken only in warnings. Trust was both the greatest treasure and the most precarious burden of the Victorian baker. And so, the baker lived constantly under the gaze of his community. His ovens fed them, his labor sustained them, and his reputation bound him to them. He could not escape their judgment, nor could they escape their reliance on him. It was a relationship at once intimate and fraught, built on flour, fire, and the fragile currency of trust. Health, medicine, and the cost of care. The Victorian baker's life was not only shaped by work and reputation, it was also defined by health. The conditions of the bakery left their marks on the body: the heat of the ovens, the weight of the dough, the dust of the flour. Illness and injury were not occasional accidents but constant companions, and in an age before modern medicine, the cost of care was often as heavy as the labor itself. The bakery's greatest hidden danger lay in the very air. Flour dust, stirred with every knead and sweep, filled the lungs of bakers day after day. Breathing it in caused what some called baker's lung, a condition marked by coughing, shortness of breath, and exhaustion. What began as irritation grew into chronic illness. Lungs weakened until the simplest tasks became struggles. In an era before proper masks or ventilation, there was little escape. Many bakers lived with a persistent wheeze, their breath carrying the ghost of their ovens long after the day's work had ended. Then there was the heat. Ovens roared at unbearable temperatures, and bakers stood before them for hours, sweat pouring from their bodies, their skin scorched by bursts of flame and steam. Burns were common, a hand brushed against iron, a face caught the rush of hot air as an oven door opened, or boiling water spilled in the chaos of preparation. Even minor burns festered in the absence of antiseptics, turning into wounds that lingered painfully, sometimes leading to infection. The body carried the strain in countless other ways. Backs bent under sacks of flour, weighing more than a child. Arms grew weary from endless kneading, wrists inflamed by repetition. Feet ached after long nights on stone floors. Sleep, when it came, was often shallow and short, stolen in odd hours between shifts. Exhaustion became a permanent condition, dulling senses and leaving bakers vulnerable to accidents. Medicine in Victorian Britain offered little relief. Doctors were expensive, and many working families could not afford their visits. For bakers, whose incomes fluctuated with harvests and debts, calling a doctor was often a last resort. Instead, they turned to home remedies: poultices of herbs for burns, teas to ease coughing, rest for aching limbs. But rest was a luxury few could afford. Ovens waited for no man, and customers expected bread each morning. A sick baker meant lost income, and so many labored through illness, their conditions worsening with every shift. Charitable hospitals existed, but access was limited and treatment often rudimentary. A baker with a severe burn might be admitted, but antiseptic methods were not yet widely practiced. The risk of infection remained high. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, or chronic lung conditions were treated with little more than rest and tonics. Recovery was uncertain, and many left the hospital no better than they had entered. The cost of care was not only physical, but also financial. A family's savings could vanish in the wake of a single illness. If the baker was too sick to work, apprentices might carry on for a time, but the quality of the bread could suffer, and customers noticed. A prolonged illness could drive a family into debt, threatening the survival of the bakery itself. Some families took in boarders, others pawned possessions, all in an effort to cover the cost of illness. For many, poverty was not caused by laziness or mismanagement, but by the cruel misfortune of sickness. The emotional toll was heavy as well. Wives watched anxiously as their husbands coughed through the night. Children feared the exhaustion etched into their fathers' faces, and apprentices wondered if they, too, would one day suffer the same fate. Illness did not belong to the individual alone. It haunted the entire household, a shadow over every loaf baked, every coin earned. Some reformers took notice of these conditions. Medical men and social critics warned of the dangers of flour dust, the exhausting hours, and the lack of proper ventilation in bakeries. Reports were written, recommendations made. But change came slowly. Regulations lagged behind, and enforcement was weak. Many bakers continued to work as their fathers and grandfathers had, enduring the same risks, sustained only by tradition and necessity. Despite the hardships, resilience remained. Bakers learned small ways to ease their burdens, hanging damp cloths to settle dust, cooling their bodies with basins of water, sharing remedies whispered down through generations. Communities sometimes rallied to help sick bakers, bringing food or lending coins, though such kindness could not undo the systemic challenges they faced. The story of health in the Victorian bakery is ultimately a story of endurance. These men and women bore wounds and illness as constant companions, shaping their lives in ways often unseen by those who ate their bread. The golden crusts and soft loaves that appeared on tables each morning carried within them not only the taste of wheat and yeast, but also the silent sacrifices of health made by those who baked them. When we speak of the Victorian baker, we must remember not only his skill and labor, but also the toll it exacted upon his body. His lungs carried the dust of 1,000 loaves, his skin the scars of countless burns, his bones the ache of ceaseless work. And still he baked on, for bread was not optional. It was survival for himself, his family, and his community. The cost of care in this world was measured not only in coin but in years of life, in breaths lost, in nights without rest. It was the hidden price of bread, one seldom acknowledged by those who consumed it, yet always paid by those who made it. Technology, change, and the future of baking. The Victorian age was not only a period of soot, struggle, and long hours. It was also an era of remarkable change. Technology swept across Britain, altering industries and reshaping lives, and bakeries were no exception. Yet the relationship between tradition and innovation was uneasy. The baker's craft, built on centuries of skill, often resisted machinery, even as the promise of progress loomed just beyond the flour-coated door. For much of the early 19th century, baking remained a craft practiced as it had been for generations. Ovens were heated by wood or coal, bread was mixed and kneaded by hand, and apprentices still bore the brunt of heavy labor. The warmth of the bakery came not only from the roaring ovens, but from the rhythm of human effort, the kneading, the shaping, the careful tending of fire and dough. But whispers of change grew louder with each passing decade, carried by the hum of engines and the march of industry. Steam power transformed many trades, and bakers began to experiment with it as well. Steam-heated ovens promised consistency, reducing the risk of loaves burning on one side or baking unevenly. For bakers accustomed to constant tending of fires, this was no small advantage. A steady, controllable heat meant more predictable results, and predictability was a treasure in a business where failure could mean lost customers and wasted ingredients. Yet these new ovens were expensive, and not every baker could afford them. For small family bakeries already working on slim margins, the investment was often out of reach. Larger urban bakeries, however, began to embrace the technology, gaining an edge over their smaller rivals. As cities grew and demand for bread increased, these more modern bakeries could produce loaves in greater numbers, faster and more reliably. Alongside ovens came innovations in mixing and kneading. Hand labor remained dominant, but machines appeared, great iron contraptions with rotating arms or paddles that could knead dough more quickly than an apprentice's weary hands. These machines reduced the physical strain on workers, though they also threatened to replace the apprentices themselves. Where once a boy might have learned the trade by kneading dough until his arms ached, now the machine could take his place, leaving fewer opportunities for training. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Many bakers, proud of their craft, distrusted machinery. They argued that bread made by hand had a character, a quality, that machines could never replicate. Some customers agreed, preferring the familiarity of traditional loaves over the uniform products of larger, mechanized bakeries. Tradition carried weight, especially in smaller communities where personal relationships mattered more than sheer production. But in the swelling cities of Victorian Britain, efficiency often won the day. The working classes needed bread, and they needed it cheap. Large bakeries, fueled by technology, could supply this demand, even if it meant sacrificing the individuality of the loaf. The age of the mass-produced bread had begun, though not without resistance. Technology also brought changes in flour itself. Milling, once done with stone, shifted towards steel roller mills by the late 19th century. These mills produced finer, whiter flour, which quickly became fashionable. White bread, once a luxury reserved for the wealthy, became more accessible to the middle and working classes. Its purity was celebrated, its pale color seen as modern and clean compared to the darker loaves of the past. Yet this shift had consequences. Much of the nutrition in the grain was stripped away in the process, leaving bread softer and whiter but less nourishing. This transformation in bread mirrored the broader tensions of the Victorian world. The pursuit of progress balanced against the loss of tradition, the drive for efficiency weighed against concerns for health. Bakers stood at the intersection of these forces, their livelihoods shaped by decisions made in factories, mills, and markets. For many small bakers, survival meant adaptation. Some invested in new ovens when they could, others specialized in niche products, cakes, pastries, or regional breads, that still relied on handcraft and personal skill. The growing railway network also played a role, carrying flour, yeast, and even finished loaves farther than ever before. Bread, once a profoundly local product, began to move across regions, its journey no longer limited to the walk from the bakery to the customer's home. The cultural meaning of bread shifted as well. In earlier centuries, bread was a simple necessity, the foundation of every meal. But in the Victorian era, it became a marker of class and modernity. To eat white bread was to embrace progress. To cling to coarse, dark loaves was, in the eyes of some, to remain behind. Bakers navigated these perceptions, offering different loaves to meet the expectations of both tradition and change. Yet even as machinery spread, the dangers of the baker's job persisted. Flour dust still hung in the air, burns still scarred skin, exhaustion still weighed on the body. Machines reduced some burdens but introduced new risks. Hands caught in gears, arms pulled by paddles, injuries caused by inexperience around unfamiliar technology. The promise of progress was real, but it was never free of cost. By the close of the century, the bakery was a microcosm of Victorian society, torn between the old and the new, balancing innovation with tradition, efficiency with individuality. The small neighborhood baker still rose before dawn, tending ovens by hand, crafting loaves with care. But in the distance, larger bakeries churned out thousands of identical loaves, feeding cities where anonymity and mass production were the norm. The future of baking, like the future of the Victorian world, lay in this tension. Would tradition endure, carried forward by those who valued skill and heritage? Or would machinery and industry sweep it away, leaving only uniformity in its place? For the bakers of the age, the answer was uncertain. But what is clear looking back is that the Victorian bakery stood at a crossroads, its path shaped by forces far greater than flour, yeast, and heat. As we close this chapter, imagine the flicker of both old and new, the warm glow of a coal-fired oven beside the hiss of a steam-heated one, the rhythmic slap of hands on dough alongside the steady churn of iron paddles. This was the soundscape of change, the mingling of past and future. And through it all, bread remained, humble yet essential, binding together the lives of bakers and the communities they fed. The legacy of Victorian bakers. When we step back and look at the story of the Victorian baker, we see more than hot ovens, weary apprentices, and clouds of flour dust. We see a legacy, one baked into the very heart of modern society. For the work of these bakers and the sacrifices they made did not simply vanish when their shops closed or their ovens cooled. Their lives shaped how we understand food, labor, and community, even today. The first legacy is bread itself. Bread was more than nourishment in Victorian Britain. It was survival. For working-class families, bread could make up half or even more of daily calories. Its price was watched closely, its availability a matter of social concern. When bread was scarce, unrest grew. When it was plentiful, life, though still hard, was possible. Bakers carried the immense responsibility of producing this staple every day. Their craft ensured that millions of people had enough to eat, even if just barely. The simplicity of bread belies its importance. Without it, entire cities would have starved. But bread was not only physical sustenance, it was also cultural. The kinds of loaves produced, whether dark rye, hearty brown, or newly fashionable white, told stories about class, aspiration, and identity. White bread became the bread of progress, an emblem of refinement and status. Darker loaves, once staples, were increasingly dismissed as old-fashioned or inferior. In this shift, we see how bakers helped translate industrial and social changes directly into daily life. Every loaf carried a message, not just of nourishment, but of belonging. Another legacy lies in labor itself. The harsh conditions of the Victorian bakery, long hours, dangerous environments, meager pay, reflect the wider struggles of the working class during this period. The baker's aching back, burned hands, and dust-filled lungs tell the same story as the miner's blistered skin or the factory worker's tired eyes. These lives collectively pushed society to ask hard questions. Should men and children work to exhaustion simply to survive? Should trades be left unregulated, with health and safety ignored in the name of profit? It was these questions, raised again and again by reformers, writers, and workers themselves, that laid the groundwork for later labor protections. Though change was slow, the hardships of bakers and others eventually contributed to the rise of laws that limited working hours, improved safety, and restricted child labor. The Victorian bakers' suffering became part of the chorus demanding a better life for those who toiled. In this sense, their legacy stretches beyond flour and ovens, into the rights and protections we now take for granted. The bakery also left behind lessons about community. Bakers often worked within close-knit neighborhoods, their shops serving as landmarks of daily life. People visited not only to buy bread but to hear gossip, share news, and exchange small kindnesses. The bakery was a place of warmth, where the smells of fresh loaves softened the harshness of urban life. Even in poverty, even when bread was coarse or burned, there was comfort in its presence. This sense of shared sustenance created bonds between baker and customer, reminding us that food is always more than fuel. It is connection. We also inherit the contradictions of Victorian baking. The embrace of technology brought efficiency, but also distanced people from the intimacy of handcraft. The rise of white bread improved accessibility for some while diminishing nutritional value for many. Bakers stood between progress and tradition, embodying both the promises and the costs of industrial change. In remembering them, we are reminded that every innovation carries trade-offs, every gain shadowed by some loss. Even today, echoes of the Victorian bakery remain. The very idea of the daily loaf continues, whether in supermarket shelves stacked with packaged bread or in small artisan bakeries reviving older methods. The debates about nutrition, mass production, and food quality that began in the 19th century continue to this day. When we ask whether bread should be sourdough or sliced, artisan or factory-made, organic or processed, we are still grappling with questions first faced in the age of coal-fired ovens and flour-dusted apprentices. The Victorian baker's legacy is also etched in memory, though often quietly. Few of their names are recorded, few of their lives remembered in detail. Yet their work fed generations, their sacrifices sustained cities, their craft held together households across the nation. They were anonymous in life, and they remain so in history, but their impact was vast. To acknowledge their legacy is to honor those who labored without glory, whose contribution was measured in loaves, not monuments. And finally, the legacy of Victorian bakers reminds us of endurance. In conditions that broke health, strained families, and stole sleep, they carried on. They rose in darkness to light ovens, they endured burns and coughs, they bent their backs to knead dough, because they had to. Their resilience speaks across centuries, a quiet testament to the strength of ordinary people. In their endurance, we see not just hardship, but humanity's remarkable ability to persist, even when the odds are against us. So when we picture the Victorian baker, let us see more than soot and sweat. Let us also see the foundation they laid, the bread on the table, the labor reforms on the horizon, the community held together by their work. Their legacy lives on in every slice of bread we eat, in every labor right we enjoy, in every small shop that still gathers neighbors together. It is a legacy of sustenance, of struggle, of survival. As you rest tonight, imagine the last loaf pulled from a coal-fired oven, its crust still crackling, its smell filling the narrow bakery. Imagine the tired baker, wiping flour from his brow, knowing he has done enough for another day. That quiet moment, ordinary, fleeting, is the essence of his legacy. Not written in books, not celebrated in statues, but baked into life itself. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of our long walk through the flour-dusted streets and fiery ovens of Victorian Britain. Together we have entered the world of the baker, a world of toil, of heat, of shadows, and of resilience. We have seen how bread was not merely food, but the very heartbeat of the working class, the daily anchor of life in crowded cities and struggling villages. It is easy, from the comfort of today, to imagine that bread simply appeared on tables as it does now, sliced and wrapped in neat packages, bought in supermarkets with little thought. But in the Victorian age, bread was never a given. It was won, day after day, by the sweat, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance of bakers who worked through the night so that others might wake to a fresh loaf. Think of the dangers they faced: flour dust filling lungs, burns from roaring ovens, the exhaustion of endless hours, and the cruel uncertainty of illness. These men, women, and often children, bore burdens we can scarcely imagine, and yet they carried on. Their work fed millions, though it often consumed their health, their years, and their strength. To reflect on their lives is to honor them, not as nameless figures lost to history, but as human beings who gave so much to sustain the world around them. The Victorian bakery was more than a workplace. It was a stage where the dramas of industrial Britain played out. The tension between handcraft and machinery, the struggle between tradition and progress, the contrast between nourishment and exploitation. Each loaf tells a story, and each story reminds us that history is not just made by kings and parliaments, but also by bakers, miners, weavers, and laborers who shaped the daily lives of countless others. As you rest now, imagine the quiet after the ovens have cooled. The stones no longer glow, the flour has settled, and the baker sits, weary but satisfied, knowing his work has sustained his family and his community for another day. In that silence, in that stillness, we find the essence of endurance. History is often loud, filled with battles and proclamations, but sometimes its truest voice is soft. The sound of a crust breaking, the sigh of a man who has survived another night's labor. Here, in Mild History, we remember those voices. We bring them into the present, not to dwell in sorrow, but to find connection, to see in their struggles a reflection of our own humanity. And perhaps, as you drift to sleep, you will carry with you the gentle hum of those bakeries, the warmth of bread fresh from the oven, and the quiet dignity of those who made it possible. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Are you in a busy city where the glow of streetlights echoes the lamps of Victorian London? Or perhaps in a quiet village where the night is deep and still, much like the towns where bakers once rose before dawn? Share your corner of the world in the comments. It's always a joy to know where these stories travel. And if you found comfort in this story, consider joining me again. Subscribe to Mild History, so together we can continue wandering through time, uncovering the lives of ordinary people whose quiet labors shaped extraordinary histories. For now, let the ovens fade to darkness, let the flour dust settle, let the clamor of the Victorian streets grow distant. Rest easy, dear listener, knowing that you have walked through their world and honored their memory. May your night be peaceful, and your dreams as warm and nourishing as a fresh loaf of bread. Good night.